It is with a heavy heart that I take up my pen to write these words, knowing they may be the last I ever record concerning the singular gifts of my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. In a halting and, I feel deeply, inadequate fashion, I have tried over the years to give some account of the strange experiences we shared together, from the chance meeting that first brought us into each other's orbit, up through his involvement in the matter of the naval treaty, an involvement that prevented what might otherwise have become a serious international crisis. I had intended to stop there, to say nothing at all of the event that has left a void in my life, which 2 years have done little to fill. But recent letters from Colonel James Moriarty defending his late brother's memory have forced my hand, and I find I have no choice now but to lay the full truth before the public exactly as it occurred. I alone know the complete story, and I am satisfied the time has come when nothing is served by continuing to suppress it. It should be remembered that after my marriage and my establishment in private practice, the close daily companionship Holmes and I had shared became, of necessity, somewhat reduced. He still came to me occasionally when he wanted a companion for an investigation, though these occasions grew steadily rarer, until, looking back through the year 1890, I find only 3 cases of which I kept any record. Through that winter and into the early spring of 1891, I read in the papers that he'd been engaged by the French government on a matter of the highest importance, and received 2 brief notes from him, one from Narbonne, one from Nimes, suggesting his stay abroad would run long. It was then, with some real surprise, that I saw him walk into my consulting room on the evening of April the 24th. He struck me immediately as paler and thinner than I remembered. "I've been using myself up rather too freely of late," he said, catching my look before I could voice the thought. "Have you any objection to my closing your shutters?" The only light in the room came from my reading lamp. Holmes moved along the wall, drew the shutters together, and bolted them securely. "You're afraid of something," I said. "Well, I am." "Of what?" "Of air guns." "My dear Holmes, what can you possibly mean?" "I think you know me well enough, Watson, to understand I am not a nervous man by nature. At the same time, it's stupidity rather than courage to refuse acknowledging real danger when it stands close beside you. Might I trouble you for a match?" He drew in the smoke of his cigarette as though its soothing effect were genuinely welcome to him. "I must apologize for calling so late," he continued, "and I must further ask you to indulge my leaving your house presently by climbing over your back garden wall, rather than through the front door." "What does all this mean?" I asked. He held out his hand, and I saw in the lamplight that 2 of his knuckles were split and still bleeding. "It's not empty air you're looking at," he said, smiling faintly. "On the contrary, it's solid enough for a man to break his hand against. Is Mrs. Watson at home?" "She's away visiting," I told him. "Indeed, you're alone then?" "Quite alone." "Then it makes it that much easier for me to suggest you come away with me to the continent for a week." "Where to?" I asked. "Anywhere at all. It makes no difference to me." There was something deeply strange in all of this. Taking an aimless holiday was not in Holmes's nature, and something in his pale, drawn face told me his nerves were stretched to their very limit. He read the question in my eyes, pressed his fingertips together, elbows on his knees, and explained. "You've probably never heard of Professor Moriarty," he said. "Never. Ah, there's the genius and the wonder of the whole thing," he said. "The man pervades London, and no one has ever heard his name. That's precisely what elevates him above every other criminal in the record of crime. I tell you, Watson, quite seriously, if I could defeat that man, if I could rid society of him entirely, I would consider my own career to have reached its summit and would be ready to retire to some quieter line of work altogether. Between the two of us, the recent cases where I've been of some service to the Scandinavian royal family and to the French Republic have left me comfortably enough placed that I could easily live the quiet life that suits me best and devote myself to my chemical studies. But I could not rest, Watson. I could not sit calmly in my chair, knowing a man like Professor Moriarty still walked the streets of London unchallenged. What has he actually done? I asked. His career has been an extraordinary one, Holmes said. Good birth, excellent education, and a genuinely phenomenal mathematical gift. At 21, he wrote a treatise on the binomial theorem that gained real recognition across Europe. On the strength of it, he won a mathematical chair at a smaller university and seemed set for a brilliant career. But the man carried hereditary tendencies of the most diabolical kind. A criminal strain ran through his blood, and rather than being tempered by his extraordinary intellect, it was sharpened and made infinitely more dangerous by it. Dark rumors began circling him at the university, and he was eventually compelled to resign and come down to London, where he set himself up as an army coach. That much is public knowledge. What I am about to tell you now is what I've discovered entirely on my own. As you know, Watson, no one understands the higher criminal world of London better than I do. For years, I've sensed some power standing behind the ordinary malefactor, some deep organizing intelligence that continually obstructs the law and shields the wrongdoer. Again and again, across forgery cases, robberies, murders, I felt the presence of this force and traced its hand in a number of undiscovered crimes I was never even personally consulted on. For years I worked to break through the veil concealing it, until finally I caught the thread and followed it, through 1,000 cunning turns, straight to former Professor Moriarty of mathematical fame. He is the Napoleon of crime, Watson, the organizer of half of everything evil and nearly all of what goes undetected in this entire city. He's a genius, a philosopher, an abstract thinker of the first rank. He sits motionless, like a spider at the center of its web, but that web carries 1,000 threads, and he senses every quiver along every one of them. He does very little himself. He only plans, but his agents are numerous and superbly organized. Is there a crime to commit, a document to steal, a house to rob, a man to be removed? Word passes to the professor, the matter gets arranged, and it's carried out. The agent may be caught. If so, money appears for his bail or his defense. But the central power that employs him is never caught, never even suspected. This was the organization I traced, Watson, and to breaking it apart I devoted every ounce of my energy. But the professor had fenced himself round with safeguards so cleverly devised that, whatever I tried, evidence that would actually convict in a court of law seemed impossible to obtain. You know my abilities, my dear Watson, and yet, at the end of 3 months, I was forced to admit I had finally met an opponent who matched me intellectually. My horror at his crimes was very nearly lost in my admiration for his skill. But at last, he made a slip. Only a small one, but more than he could afford with me pressing so close behind him. I seized my opportunity, and from that point I woven my net around him until, Now it stands ready to close entirely. In 3 days, that is to say, on Monday next, everything will be ripe, and the professor, along with every principal member of his gang, will be in the hands of the police. Then will come the greatest criminal trial of the century, the unraveling of more than 40 separate mysteries, and the rope for every one of them. But if we move even slightly too soon, they may yet slip through our fingers at the very last moment. If I could have accomplished all this without Professor Moriarty's knowledge, everything would have gone smoothly. But he was too cunning for that. He saw every step I took to draw the net tighter. Again and again, he tried to break free. And just as often, I headed him off. I tell you, my friend, if a detailed account of that silent contest could ever be written out, it would stand as the finest piece of thrust and parry in the entire history of detection. I have never risen to such heights, and never been so hard-pressed by any opponent. He cut deep, and yet I always managed to cut deeper still. This very morning, the final steps were taken, and only 3 days remained to complete the whole business. I was sitting in my room, turning it over in my mind, when the door opened, and Professor Moriarty himself stood before me. My nerves are fairly proof against most things, Watson, but I confess I felt a genuine start seeing the very man who'd occupied so much of my thinking standing there on my own threshold. His appearance was already quite familiar to me. Extremely tall and thin, his forehead domed forward in a pale curve, his eyes deeply sunk into his skull, clean-shaven, pale, with something ascetic and still faintly professorial in his features. His shoulders rounded from years of study, his face pushed slightly forward and perpetually oscillating from side to side in a curiously reptilian way. He peered at me with real curiosity in those puckered eyes. "You have less frontal development than I would have expected," he said finally. "It's a dangerous habit, keeping a loaded firearm in the pocket of one's dressing gown." "Danger is simply part of my trade," I told him. "That isn't danger," he said. "That is inevitable destruction. You stand in the way not merely of an individual, but of an enormously powerful organization, the full extent of which even your considerable cleverness has failed to grasp. You must stand clear, Mr. Holmes, or be trodden underfoot." "You evidently don't know me," he said. "On the contrary," I answered, "I think it's fairly evident I do. Please, take a chair. I can spare you 5 minutes if you have anything to say." "Everything I have to say has already crossed your mind," he told me. "Then perhaps my answer has crossed yours as well," I replied. "You stand fast then?" "Absolutely." He put his hand into his pocket, and I raised the pistol from the table where I had laid it. But he only drew out a small memorandum book in which he'd noted several dates. "You crossed my path on the 4th of January, he said. "On the 23rd you inconvenienced me. By mid-February I was seriously hampered by you. By the end of March I was absolutely obstructed in my plans. And now, at the close of April, I find myself, through your continual persecution, in genuine danger of losing my liberty entirely. The situation has become an impossible one. Have you any suggestion to make?" I asked him. "You must drop it, Mr. Holmes," he said, swaying his head slowly. "You really must, you know. After Monday," I told him. "Cut that," he said. "I'm quite certain a man of your intelligence can see there's only one possible outcome to this affair. You must withdraw. You've maneuvered things in such a way that we are left with only one resource remaining. It's been a genuine intellectual pleasure watching you grapple with this, and I say quite sincerely, it would grieve me to be forced into any extreme measure. You're smiling, sir, but I promise you I mean it." The fact was, The moment he entered, I had instantly recognized the extreme personal danger I stood in. His only conceivable path to safety lay in silencing me permanently. In an instant, I'd slipped the revolver from the drawer into my pocket and stood covering him through the cloth. At his remark, I drew it out entirely and laid it cocked upon the table. He kept smiling and blinking, but something in his eyes made me very glad I had it there. "I'm afraid," I said, rising, "that in the pleasure of this conversation, I'm neglecting business of importance elsewhere." He rose too and looked at me in silence, shaking his head sadly. "Well, well," he said finally, "it seems a pity, but I've done what I could. I know every move you intend to make. You can do nothing before Monday. This has been a duel between the two of us. Mr. Holmes, you hope to place me in dock. I tell you, I will never stand in any dock. You hope to defeat me. I tell you, you will never defeat me. If you're clever enough to bring destruction down upon me, rest assured I shall do exactly the same to you." "You've paid me several compliments, Mr. Moriarty," I said. "Allow me to return one. When I say that if I could be certain of accomplishing the first, I would, in the public interest, cheerfully accept the second. I can promise you the one, but not the other," he snarled, and turning his rounded back on me, went peering and blinking out of the room. That was my singular interview with Professor Moriarty. I confess, it left an unpleasant impression on my mind. His soft, precise manner of speaking carries a conviction of genuine sincerity that a common bully could never produce. You'll ask, naturally, why not simply take police precautions against him? The reason is, I'm entirely convinced the blow, when it comes, will fall from his agents, not from him directly. I have excellent proof that this is exactly how he operates. The practice is quiet these days, I told him, and I have an accommodating neighbor who can cover for me. I'd be glad to come. You've already been assaulted then? I asked. My dear Watson, Professor Moriarty is not a man who lets grass grow beneath his feet, Holmes said. I went out around midday to transact some business in Oxford Street. As I passed the corner where Bentinck Street meets Welbeck Street, a two-horse van came whipping round the turn and was on top of me in an instant. I sprang for the footpath and saved myself by the barest fraction of a second. The van tore away round Marylebone Lane and vanished. I kept strictly to the pavement after that, but walking down Weir Street a brick fell from a rooftop and shattered to pieces at my very feet. I called the police and had the spot examined. They found slates and bricks piled up in preparation for some repair work and tried to convince me the wind had simply toppled one loose. I knew better, of course, though I could prove nothing. I took a cab after that and spent the day at my brother's rooms in Pall Mall. Now I've come round to you, and on the way here I was set upon by a rough with a bludgeon. I knocked him down, and the police have him in custody now. But I can assure you with complete confidence that no connection will ever be traced between the gentleman whose front teeth I bruised my knuckles on and the retiring mathematics coach who is, I've no doubt, at this very moment working out some equation on a blackboard 10 miles away. You won't wonder then, Watson, why my first act on entering your rooms was to close your shutters, or why I've had to beg your indulgence in leaving by some less conspicuous exit than the front door. I had often admired my friend's courage before, but never more than at that moment. Listening to him calmly recount a series of events that would have combined, for most men, into a day of pure terror. You'll spend the night here? I asked. No, my friend, he said. You might find me rather a dangerous guest. I have my own arrangements laid already, and everything will be fine. Matters have progressed far enough now that they can move forward without my direct help as far as the arrests go, though my presence would still be needed to secure conviction. It seems clear then that I can do nothing better than get myself out of the way for few remaining days before the police are free to act. It would give me real pleasure, Watson, if you'd consider coming to the continent with me. And starting tomorrow morning, I asked. Yes, if that suits you. Then these, he said, are your instructions, and I beg you, my dear Watson, to follow them exactly, because you'll now be playing a double-handed game alongside me against the cleverest rogue and the most powerful criminal syndicate in Europe. Listen carefully. Send whatever luggage you plan to take unaddressed by a trusted messenger to Victoria tonight. In the morning, send for a hansom and instruct your man specifically to take neither the first nor the second cab that presents itself. Jump into that one and drive to the Strand end of the Lowther Arcade, handing your destination to the cabman written on a slip of paper, along with a request that he not throw it away. Have your fare ready, and the instant the cab stops, dash straight through the arcade, timing yourself to reach the far side by exactly 9:15. You'll find a small brougham waiting there at the curb, driven by a man in a heavy black cloak trimmed at the collar in red. Step into it, and you'll reach Victoria in time for the Continental Express. Where will I find you? I asked. At the station. The second first-class carriage from the front will be reserved for the two of us. So the carriage itself is our meeting point, I said. Exactly. It was useless asking him to stay through the evening. It was plain enough. He believed his presence might bring danger down on the roof he was sheltering under, and that this alone was what drove him to leave. With a few hurried words about our plans for the following morning, he rose and came out with me into the garden, climbed over the wall leading to Mortimer Street, and whistled almost immediately for a passing hansom, in which I heard him drive away into the dark. In the morning, I followed his instructions to the letter. A hansom was found with all the precautions he'd specified, and I drove straight after breakfast to the Lowther Arcade, hurrying through it at the fastest pace I could manage. A brougham stood waiting, its driver, a massively built man, wrapped in a dark cloak, who the instant I'd stepped inside, whipped up the horse and rattled off toward Victoria Station. On setting me down, he turned the carriage and drove away again, without so much as a glance in my direction. So far, everything had gone admirably. My luggage was waiting, and I found the carriage Holmes had described without any difficulty, made easier still by the fact that it was the only one on the entire train marked engaged. My only real anxiety now was Holmes's continued absence. The station clock showed only 7 minutes remaining before we were due to depart. I searched in vain through the crowds of travelers and those seeing them off, hoping to spot his familiar lean figure. There was no sign of him anywhere. I spent a few minutes helping an elderly Italian priest explain, in halting English, to a porter that his luggage needed booking through to Paris. Then, after another anxious look round, I returned to my own carriage, only to find the porter had, despite my ticket, seated my decrepit Italian acquaintance there as my traveling companion. It was useless trying to explain to him that his presence was an intrusion, since my Italian was even worse than his English, so I shrugged and resigned myself, continuing to watch anxiously for my friend. A genuine chill of fear had come over me by then, wondering whether his absence meant some blow had already fallen overnight. The doors had all been shut, the whistle already blown, when, "My dear Watson," said a voice, You haven't even condescended to say good morning." I turned in complete astonishment. The aged priest had turned his face toward me, and for one instant the wrinkles smoothed away entirely. The nose drew back from the chin, the drooping lower lip firmed, the dull eyes caught fire, the stooped frame straightened. Then, just as quickly, the whole figure collapsed back into itself, and Holmes had vanished as suddenly as he'd appeared. "Good heavens," I cried. "How you startled me!" "Every precaution is still necessary," he whispered. "I have reason to believe they're hot on our trail. Ah, there's Moriarty himself." The train had already begun to move as he spoke. Glancing back, I saw a tall man pushing furiously through the crowd, waving his hand as if desperate to have train stopped. But it was too late. We were rapidly gathering speed, and a moment later had shot entirely clear of the station. "With all our precautions, you see how close we cut it," Holmes said, laughing, as he rose and shed the black cassock and hat that had formed his disguise, packing them away into a handbag. "Have you seen the morning paper, Watson?" "No." "You haven't heard about Baker Street, then?" "Baker Street?" I said. "They set fire to our rooms last night. No serious harm done." "Good heavens, Holmes! This is intolerable. They must have completely lost my trail after their bludgeon man was arrested. Otherwise, they'd never have imagined I'd returned home. They've evidently taken the precaution of watching you instead, which is exactly what brought Moriarty to Victoria this morning. You couldn't have made any misstep coming here?" "I did exactly as you instructed." "Did you find your broom waiting?" "Yes, it was there." "Did you recognize the driver?" "No." "That was my brother Mycroft," Holmes said. "It's an advantage, in a case like this, to move about without taking any hired man into your confidence. But we need to plan what to do about Moriarty now. Since this is an express train, and the boat runs in direct connection with it, I should think we've shaken him off quite effectively." "My dear Watson," he said, "you clearly haven't grasped my meaning when I told you this man operates on precisely the same intellectual plane as myself. You don't imagine that if our positions were reversed, I'd allow myself to be defeated by so slight an obstacle. Why, then, should you rate him any lower?" "What will you?" I asked. "What I would do myself." "And what would that be?" "Engage a special train." "But surely it's too late for that." "Not at all. This train stops at Canterbury, and there's always at least a quarter-hour's delay boarding the boat. He'll catch us there." "One would think we were the criminals ourselves," I said. "Let's have him arrested the moment he arrives." "That would ruin 3 months of work entirely," Holmes said. "We'd land the big fish, certainly, but the smaller ones would scatter left and right out of the net. Come Monday, we'll have every one of them. No, an arrest now is out of the question." "What then?" I asked. "We'll get out at Canterbury." "And then?" "Then we'll make a cross-country journey to New Haven and cross over to Dieppe from there. Moriarty will do exactly what I'd do in his position. He'll push on to Paris, mark down our luggage, and wait 2 full days at the station for us. Meanwhile, we'll treat ourselves to a couple of carpet bags, support the local manufacturers of whatever countries we pass through, and make our way at leisure into Switzerland by way of Luxembourg and Basel." We disembarked at Canterbury, only to discover we'd have to wait a full hour before catching a connection to New Haven. I was still watching, somewhat mournfully, the luggage van carrying my entire wardrobe disappear rapidly down the line, when Holmes tugged my sleeve and pointed further up the tracks. "Already, you see," he said. Far off, among the Kentish woods, rose a thin plume of smoke. A minute later, a carriage and engine came flying along the open curve leading into the station. We barely had time to duck behind a pile of luggage before it thundered past with a roar, blasting a wave of hot air across our faces. "There he goes," Holmes said, watching the carriage rock and sway over the points. "There are limits, you see, to our friend's intelligence. It would have been a genuine masterstroke had he deduced what I would deduce and acted accordingly." "And what would he have done had he actually caught us?" I asked. "There's no doubt whatsoever he'd have made a murderous attempt on my life, though it's a game two can play. The real question now is whether we take an early lunch here or risk starving until we reach the buffet at New Haven." We made our way to Brussels that night and spent 2 days there, moving on the third as far as Strasbourg. On Monday morning, Holmes wired the London police, and that evening, a reply was waiting for us at our hotel. He tore it open, read it, and hurled it into the grate with a bitter curse. "I might have known it," he groaned. "He's escaped." "Moriarty," I said. "They've taken the entire gang except for him. He's given them the slip entirely. Of course, once I'd left the country, there was no one left capable of matching him. But I did think I'd placed the game firmly in their hands. I really think you should return to England, Watson." "Why?" I asked. "Because you'll find me a dangerous companion now. This man's occupation is finished. He's ruined if he ever returns to London. If I read his character rightly, he'll devote every remaining ounce of his energy to revenging himself on me personally." He said as much himself in our brief interview, and I believe he meant every word of it. "I'd strongly recommend you return to your practice." It was hardly an appeal likely to succeed with someone who was both an old campaigner and an old friend. We sat arguing the point in the Strasbourg dining room for half an hour, but that same night we resumed our journey together, well on our way toward Geneva. For a genuinely charming week, we wandered up the valley of the Rhone, then branched off at Luc, and made our way over the Gamey Pass, still deep in snow, and on through Interlaken to Meiringen. It was a beautiful journey, the delicate green of spring below us, the untouched white of winter still holding the peaks above. But it was clear to me that not for one single instant did Holmes forget the shadow trailing him. In the quiet alpine villages, on the loneliest mountain passes, I could see it in his quick, watchful eyes, his sharp scrutiny of every face we passed, that he remained entirely convinced we could not walk ourselves clear of the danger following our footsteps, no matter where we went. Once, I remember, crossing the Gemmi and walking along the edge of the melancholy Dobbensee. A large rock dislodged from the ridge above us came clattering down and crashed into the lake behind us. In an instant, Holmes had scrambled up onto the ridge and stood on a high point, craning his neck in every direction. Our guide assured him that falling stones were common enough in that spot come springtime, but he said nothing in reply, only smiled at me with the expression of a man watching something he had already fully expected come to pass. And yet, for all his constant watchfulness, he was never once depressed. On the contrary, I don't believe I'd ever seen him in such genuinely high spirits. Again and again he returned to the same thought, that if he could only be assured society was rid of Professor Moriarty entirely, he would cheerfully bring his own career to its close that very day. "I think I may say, Watson, that I haven't lived entirely in vain," he told me one evening. "If my record closed tonight, I could still look back on it with a clear conscience. London's air is the sweeter for my having been in it. Across more than 1,000 cases, I'm not aware I've ever once used my abilities on the wrong side of a question. Lately, I've found myself drawn more to the problems nature presents than the shallower ones our artificial society keeps producing. Your memoirs will draw to their close, Watson, on the very day I crown my career with the capture or the destruction of the most dangerous and capable criminal in all of Europe. Footnote. It was on the 3rd of May that we reached the small village of Meiringen, where we took rooms at the Ingerhof, then kept by Peter Steiler the Elder. Our landlord was an intelligent man who spoke excellent English, having served 3 years as a waiter at the Grosvenor Hotel in London. On his advice, on the afternoon of the 4th, we set off together, intending to cross the hills and spend the night at the small hamlet of Rosenlaui. He gave us strict instructions, though, not to pass the falls of Reichenbach roughly halfway up the hill without making the short detour needed to see them properly. It is, indeed, a fearful place. The torrent, swollen by melting snow, plunges into a tremendous abyss, throwing up spray like smoke from a burning house. The shaft into which the river hurls itself is an immense chasm lined with glistening black rock, narrowing into a boiling, creaming pit of unknown depth, which brims over at last and shoots the stream onward across its jagged lip. The long, unbroken sweep of green water roaring endlessly downward, and the thick curtain of spray hissing endlessly upward, leave a man dizzy with their constant whirl and clamor. We stood near the edge, looking down at the gleam of the breaking water far below against the black rock, listening to that half-human shout that came booming up out of the depths along with the spray. The path has been cut halfway round the fall to give visitors a complete view, but it ends abruptly, and travelers must return the way they came. We had just turned to do exactly that when we saw a Swiss boy come running along the path with a letter in his hand. It bore the mark of the hotel we'd just left. It was addressed to me by the landlord himself. It explained that within a very few minutes of our departure, an English lady had arrived at the hotel in the last stages of consumption. She had wintered at Davos Platz and was traveling now to join friends at Lucerne when a sudden hemorrhage overtook her. It was thought she could hardly live more than a few hours, but it would be a great comfort to her to see an English doctor, and would I please return. Old Steiler assured me, in a postscript, that he would take it as a very great personal favor, since the lady absolutely refused to see a Swiss physician, and he felt the weight of a considerable responsibility in the matter. The appeal was one I couldn't possibly ignore. It was impossible to refuse a dying countrywoman in a foreign land, and yet I had my reservations about leaving Holmes alone. In the end, it was agreed he would keep the young Swiss messenger with him as guide and companion, while I hurried back down to Meiringen. My friend intended to remain a little longer at the falls, he said, then walk on slowly over the hill to Rosenlaui, where I would rejoin him that evening. As I turned to go, I saw him standing with his back against a rock, arms folded, gazing down into the rushing water. It was the last I was ever destined to see of him in this world. Near the bottom of the descent, I looked back. From that position, it was impossible to see the falls themselves, but I could see the curving path winding over the shoulder of the hill that led to them. Along it, a man was walking very rapidly. I could see his dark figure clearly outlined against the green hillside behind him. I noticed him and the sheer energy in his stride, but he passed from my thoughts as I hurried on toward my errand. It took me perhaps a little over an hour to reach Meiringen. Old Steiler was standing at the porch of his hotel. Well, I said, hurrying up to him, I trust she's no worse. A look of genuine surprise crossed his face, and at the first flicker of his eyebrows, my heart turned to lead in my chest. You didn't write this, I said, pulling the letter from my pocket. There's no dying English room at this hotel. Certainly not, he cried. But it carries the hotel's own mark. It must have been written by that tall Englishman who arrived just after you left, he said. But I waited to hear no more of the landlord's explanation. Already, in a rush of pure fear, I was running back down the village street toward the path I had so recently descended. It had taken me an hour coming down. For all my effort, 2 more hours had passed before I found myself back at the falls of Reichenbach. Holmes's alpine stock still stood leaning against the rock where I had left him, but there was no sign of him anywhere, and it was useless calling out his name. My only answer was my own voice echoing back to me in a rolling reverberation of the surrounding cliffs. It was the sight of that alpine stock that turned me cold and sick through and through. He had never gone on to Rosenlaui at all. He had remained on that narrow 3-foot path, sheer wall on one side, sheer drop on the other, until his enemy had finally overtaken him. The young Swiss guide was gone too. He had almost certainly been in Moriarty's pay all along, and had simply left the 2 men alone together. And then, what had happened? Who could possibly tell us what had happened then? I stood for a minute or two, trying to collect myself, dazed with the sheer horror of it. Then I began trying to think as Holmes himself would have thought, trying to apply his own methods to reading the tragedy laid out before me. It was, God help me, only too easy to do. During our earlier conversation, we had not walked all the way to the end of the path, and his alpine stock marked the exact spot where we had stood together. The dark soil there is kept permanently soft by the constant drift of spray, and even a bird would leave its track in it. 2 lines of footprints ran clearly along the farther stretch of the path, both leading away from where I stood. None led back. A few yards short of the very end, the soil had been churned entirely into mud, and the ferns and branches fringing the chasm were torn and trampled flat. I lay down my face and looked over the edge, spray soaking me from every direction. It had grown dark since I'd left, and now I could only make out, here and there, the glisten of moisture on the black rock walls, and far below, at the bottom of the shaft, the faint gleam of broken water. I shouted, and only that same half-human cry of the falls came back to answer me. But I was destined, after all, to receive one final word of greeting from my friend and companion. I mentioned that his alpine stock had been left leaning against a rock jutting out onto the path. From the top of that boulder, a gleam of something bright caught my eye, and reaching up, I found it was his silver cigarette case. As I lifted it, a small square of paper that had lain beneath it fluttered down to the ground. Unfolding it, I found 3 pages torn from his notebook, addressed to me. It was entirely characteristic of the man that the direction was as precise and the handwriting as firm and clear as if he had written it comfortably at his own desk. My dear Watson, it read, I write these few lines through the courtesy of Mr. Moriarty, who is waiting for my convenience to hold our final discussion of the matters standing between us. He has been giving me a full account of the methods by which he evaded the English police and kept himself informed of our movements throughout. They confirm entirely the very high opinion I had already formed of his abilities. I am glad to think I shall be able to rid society of any further trace of his presence, though I fear it comes at a cost that will bring pain to my friends, and to you especially, my dear Watson. I have already explained to you that my career had in any case reached its crisis point, and no possible conclusion to it could be more welcome to me than this one. Indeed, if I may make a full confession to you, I was entirely convinced the letter from Meiringen was fabrication, and I allowed you to leave on that errand, fully expecting some development along these lines would follow. Tell Inspector Patterson that the papers he needs to convict the gang can be found in Pigeonhole M, done up in a blue envelope marked Moriarty. I made every necessary disposition of my property before leaving England, and left it in my brother Mycroft's keeping. Please give my regards to Mrs. Watson, and believe me, my dear fellow, very sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes. A few remaining words will suffice to tell what little else there is. An examination by experts leaves little real doubt that a personal struggle between the two men ended, as it could hardly have failed to end in such a place, with both of them reeling over the edge, locked together in each other's arms. Any attempt at recovering their bodies proved entirely hopeless, and there, deep down in that dreadful cauldron of swirling water and seething foam, will lie for all time the most dangerous criminal and the foremost champion of the law of their entire generation. The young Swiss guide was never found again, and there can be little doubt he was simply one of the many agents Moriarty kept in his employ. As for the gang itself, it remains within public memory how completely the evidence Holmes had gathered exposed their entire organization, and how heavily the dead man's hand weighed against them at trial. Very little came out during those proceedings about their terrible chief, and if I have now been compelled to lay out a clear account of his career, it is entirely because of those misguided defenders who have tried to clear his memory through attacks upon the man I shall always regard as the best and the wisest that I have ever known.